ask you about President Carter. Now, Carter's seen as, well, often his presidency is seen as an unsuccessful presidency, the presidency of malaise, the presidency before the Reagan administration. You sent an article on Carter being a great deregulator. So there were some positives that came out of the Carter administration. Can you tell us about those, please, Darren?
Well, I mean, I always think of two things, and I kind of forgot about, you know, one of them, and the article is about the second thing, which is about deregulation, essentially. I mean, you think of deregulation in the U.S., around that time, you probably would have thought, Reagan, obviously, rather than Carter. Um, I guess, Carter would have, certainly had the reputation, and Reagan, I guess, ran on that to some extent of, Jimmy Carter being a big government guy. And, and maybe, philosophically, perhaps he ultimately was. But the reality is, two things that he did, obviously, was he did start the deregulation process in the U.S., particularly in transport, I believe rail, trucking, aviation. And those are huge things, obviously, particularly aviation, that really, I mean, all of them are obviously, but I think aviation really is something that, your average American really would have saw the benefits from. Maybe rail would have been a little bit more indirect, kind of might have been part of, because they were really deregulating in terms of like sort of so much transport, like Amtrak. It would have been more kind of to do with freight, and people would have saw some of those benefits, but, it would have been kind of a little bit more indirect. Same with trucking, trucking would have fed through and, lower prices and better services and all that to consumers ultimately. But the aviation thing was the thing I think that really stuck out. And which later came to Australia, and perhaps I'm not, I guess, 100% sure, but, Australia usually often does look to the U.S. to get some of its ideas, both good and bad. And the other thing, just quickly to mention, was that Carter appointed Paul Volcker as the head of the Federal Reserve. And, for mine, at least in my lifetime, I think he is by far the best chairman of the Federal Reserve in terms of being, someone who was, a very responsible person of the Federal Reserve, and, having to do what he had to do to try to fight inflation from the 1970s. And then, once he did that, to not then just go back to sort of like easy money. So sorry, I covered kind of probably more ground in just that introduction than you were looking for. But
No, that's good. That's good. I think it's a good point about Volcker. I think most economists would agree with you on Paul Volcker. Certainly, I mean, Greenspan's legacy, his reputation was essentially wrecked by the financial crisis. If it weren't for that, then he would have been the maestro. I mean, that's what people were calling him. But since the financial crisis, I mean, and he's seen as the Greenspan put they talk about, and I mean, Greenspan's policies are seen as having helped bring about that crisis. So I agree with you on Paul Volcker. On airlines, I think you're right. I mean, Australia, we had a 2-airline policy, and that wasn't changed until the 1980s. So we had the same problems, the restrictions on competition. Now, Carter introduced, it looks like it's the Airline Deregulation Act in 1978. So that prohibited states from regulating air, carrier prices, routes, and services. So I think at one time in the States, there were rules about how many airlines could compete in a particular market, and it was seen as, oh, this is better for consumers because then you don't have all of this terrible competition, which is undermining the viability of the airlines. I mean, that's how they thought, right? You've seen
well, you don't want the consumer to have too much choice. That's just, too difficult.
Well, wasn't there that scene in The Aviator with Alan Alda playing was he a regulator or a senator? And Alec Baldwin was playing One Trip from Pan Am, and they were basically making the case, oh, this is justifying the regulation of the airways, and because they wanted to crush Howard Hughes, who was trying to compete with them.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Yeah.
I haven't seen that movie, sorry, yeah.
Oh, you'd love it. It's a great film. I mean, DiCaprio is an amazing actor, and but there's that little that sort of subplot there about the airline regulation, and Alan Alda playing the senator, and I'm pretty sure that's the Aviator. Anyway, I put a link in the show notes. It was really good. It's worth seeing. And I think there are some. Sorry.
Yeah. Sorry, I was going to say one I forgot to mention, the deregulation. This one might be something a bit closer to your own heart, perhaps. Is that his deregulation efforts extended to the production of beer, making the kind of the particularly the craft beers and all that sort of thing. That industry kind of really grew in the wake of that, which is something I didn't even realize. I knew about the aviation stuff, and that's really important, obviously. But it's interesting that it even extended to things like beer. So
yeah. Well, I mean, that's an important industry for Milwaukee, isn't it? Really? I mean,
that's true.
Are you the beer capital of the US?
Dude, well, they might have been against it because they like the big, like Miller was here. Miller still is here in Milwaukee, and there were other ones that have since probably really turned into craft beers. Actually, interestingly enough, these bigger, like there was Schlitz and Old Milwaukee and Pabst and all these other ones that once upon a time were quite large beer companies, and I think they've kind of shrunk to become almost mid-tier, possibly even more competing with the craft beers than they are with like Miller and Budweiser.
Yeah.
So possibly maybe Milwaukeeans weren't all that keen on the deregulation camps.
Yeah. Good point. Okay. Well, it's an extraordinary legacy, and I'll put some links in the show notes or estimates of how much it saved in terms of airfares. I mean, airfares certainly here in Australia used to be prohibitively expensive, and you'd rarely fly. I mean, it was just so expensive even in the 80s, and so there's a story that Karen Chester tells. She's a former Treasury official here, about how her mother, she couldn't go visit her dying father in Perth because of the prohibitive airfares at the time. Just tragic story. And now, in real terms, they're much cheaper. So many, many more people flying. That's the same as in the States. So, and Alfred Kahn, was it Alfred Kahn, the economist, who was an advisor to Jimmy Carter, who was an important figure in that story, Darren?
Yeah, I believe so. And when I've my early days as an economist, out of university, I first started doing sort of competition policy at New South Wales Treasury, but then my second job was at the Queensland Competition Authority doing, regulation of infrastructure and all that sort of stuff. And, the first kind of textbook that I kind of read was Alfred Kahn's. He's got like a super thick 2-volume, sort of book on the economics of regulation. And volume 2, I think, was largely devoted to this sort of stuff. A lot of these deregulation efforts, particularly, the administration's deregulation efforts that, that's where I first cut my teeth on regulatory economics and the economics of deregulation as well, sort of thing. Yeah. So say the Queensland Competition Authority was trying to do kind of both, like be a part of, as their name suggests, that maybe you help competition and where it can be, sort of introduced or helped along, if you like. That was kind of, their dual mandate. And I think all the kind of Australian state regulators kind of had that, and the ACCC at the federal level. Now, now they've kind of not so much involved in that sort of thing anymore. They kind of straight up regulation rather than being involved in deregulation. But at the time when I joined the QCA, they were certainly, trying to do that sort of thing as well.
Yeah. I'll put a link in the show notes.
It was the textbook, basically, and that field.
Yeah. And do you have any memories of the Carter administration? Were you living in the States at the time?
Oh, I was a little kid, and but not really.
Okay.
My kind of, Reagan's. I have stronger memories of Reagan because I was getting a bit older, sort of thing as a kid, so I'm starting to remember Reagan more than Carter. But yeah, kind of small memories, But as a little kid, peanut farmer or something, and his brother Billy and his Billy beer.
Right.
You go look that up.
Yeah, I vaguely remember all the bad news because I think when I first became conscious of the news was probably late 70s, early 80s. And the news at that time coming out of, well, I mean, worldwide was just terrible. I mean, and, Carter there was high inflation, wasn't there, particularly after the revolution in Iran, and then because of, impacts on the oil market. And then the hostage crisis, which just
Yeah.
went on, of the hostages from the American embassy in Tehran, which just went on forever. And I mean, that was,
That was probably my first memories, along with the peanut farming and the frivolous sort of stuff, about him, being, from a farming
yeah,
back, his brother being a redneck who liked beer.
yeah, yeah. So I think
But yeah,
it's,
you're right.
yeah. So it's interesting. He's got a mixed record on the economy, good on the micro, but generally people think the macro story under Carter was poor. But his post-presidential legacy's been extraordinary. I mean, he seems to be much loved. He's built houses for homeless people. When he goes on flights, he shakes everyone's hands. Yeah, seems just to have a really quality, decent man. So yes, I think an extraordinary life.
Well, and it's funny that what the article I sent to you was from, the Mises Institute.
Mm.
And, there's another one which I could share with you. It wouldn't be too hard to find. Is there was an article there about basically the author was suggesting the last, if you like, intellectual or debate was actually Carter and Reagan.
Mm.
Good debate about issues and policy. Not this kind of attacking each other and attacking each other as people and all that sort of stuff. There was levity, obviously, at times, in the debate, between Reagan and Carter. I think they even had at least the levity carried over into the next election, 1984, with Reagan and trying to remember the fellow.
Mondale.
Mondale, that's right. Carter's vice president. So, times have changed. Obviously, not always for the better, in terms of like the quality of presidential debates. So someone was making the case, basically that was kind of the high watermark, if you
Mm.
like, of presidential debates was Reagan and Carter in 1980.